Good morning to all our dear members this fine morning. I hope you guys have been well. Welcome to our BB at 9. Today's topic is pretty amazing, and we have guest speakers all the way from Switzerland. Basically, I will just do the intro right now. CEO succession is without a doubt one of the most important tasks of any board. Yet a large fraction of CEO succession fails, with often detrimental effects on all parties involved. With so much at stake, it is only sensible to ask what boards can do to increase the odds of success. Today we'll be joined by Thomas Keil from Keil, from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, Mariana Zangrillo, author, speaker, transformational leader, and angel investor, an amazing woman all the way from Switzerland as well. Mariana and Thomas, Carl, if you could just turn on your cameras. So I will be handing over to Thomas and Mariana. Thank you so much for joining us today, guys.
Morning again, and thank you very much for having us. So I think we're actually starting the conversation today with another poll, which probably sets us better into the conversation. So thank you for your answers. It's not a very easy question, because naturally the board has a lot of different tasks, and there are also some differences across legislations in terms of what the board is expected to do and what the board is actually responsible for. But research shows actually that hiring the CEO is in reality one of the most important tasks, because the CEO is, despite everything, the one of the most important indicator of company corporate performance. So yes, the CEO is one of the key. Hiring CEO is one of the most important tasks of the board. At the same time, performance post-succession fluctuates dramatically. That basically means that after CEOs are coming aboard, we see very many different outcomes. So in some cases, the CEO succession works well and the company does well. In some cases, become an utter disaster. And in those cases, clearly, there will be a dramatic cost for all the stakeholders, not only for the actually for the organization. In our research, which we have addressed in our book, we talk about a lot of examples, a lot of cases. We thought to pick up 2 names and bring them to today's webinar, because these are known organizations and probably some of you have heard about these stories. John Flannery, he has been for almost 30 years at GE, very successful career, and in the end, he was appointed internally in a situation where the board felt very confident to appoint John. However, what happened is that a lot of surprises came afterwards. So he realized that many things that he wasn't aware of were actually happening in the organization. And after less than a year, he basically had to leave the organization, and his career, one could say, was basically destroyed, on top of creating a lot of assets for GE. We actually had the pleasure to speak recently with John over the phone, Thomas and I. And what actually he brought to our attention is that people tend to look at what happens to the company in these cases, but very seldom people think of what happens to the individual. And actually what happens to the individual can be even more maybe dramatic or sad, because sometimes these individuals actually end up basically not having a career anymore. So John has been able to work now as kind of a private consultant and doing other things, but basically his corporate career has been cut and it's over. Not much better the story of Leo Apotheker. He has been with SAP for over 20 years. And in his last role, he was a co-CEO. It's quite common in Germany. Many organizations and SAP has had for a long time 2 CEOs, up to last year actually, when they went to a single one. Anyway, Leo moved from SAP to HP, and also their very, very strange story. In less than a year, he managed to complete one of the biggest acquisition, one of the biggest failure of the company, and he had to leave as well. So these are 2 examples of failed CEO successions, but unfortunately the examples are far many more. So what can the board do to improve the odds of success? And maybe we go to our next poll here. So we let you give us some answers. Where should the CEO search begin? Specific candidates? We get headhunters on board sometimes, or sometimes we have in mind candidates from competitors. Should we look from a CEO profile or the firm strategy?
Here's the results.
Excellent. So, well, it's actually interesting when we are looking at it and thinking of it rationally. We do see that the firm strategy is a good starting point, but what we actually see is something very different. Maybe we go to the next slide, Thomas.
Okay.
Right. So what we actually notice is that many organizations do start from a CEO profile or even from a specific candidate. So we have interviewed many chairmen and CEOs of Fortune 500 as well and organizations. And what they often say is that they may have a job profile. So they have HR working with the executive search firm and they're looking for CEO. And sometimes they even identify a specific candidate, maybe from a competitor when they are non-competition clauses or someone within the industry. So they're actually starting very often from the individual. That's, however, not what our research tells it's the best way to start. And looking at the poll, you already had the answers ready. So the best starting point is basically looking at making a strategic diagnosis. So looking at what the firm actually needs. What are the internal and external circumstances? What are we looking at into the future? From there, identify a CEO mandate. We are going to go into this topic in the next slide. And from there, look into the CEO profile. So this is actually quite rational, but again, this is not what we see happening. And the firms which have been a little more careful in looking into strategic diagnosis have had better outcomes than the firms which have actually started from the CEO profile to identify the next candidates, whether internal or external. So if we are going into our research, we have identified basically kind of 4 key CEO mandates, which can be a guidance to look into the next CEO. And basically this framework tells us that if we're looking at the extent of strategic change needed and the length of time horizon, it is much more, it's much easier to get some guidance and looking into what kind of CEOs may be needed for the specific situation. When we are starting from the bottom left, the first mandate we have identified is a continuation mandate. So when we need to make basically minor changes, when the strategy needs to continue the way it is, and sometimes the CEO becomes almost a COO. So it's a continuation of what's already been there, just a little more of what it's already been doing. So short time horizon, little change needed, and sometimes internal candidates are the right ones to proceed into this role or to advance into this role. If change is still relatively small, but we are looking at kind of a longer time horizon in the sense that the strategy change is not expected to be major, we look into an evolution mandate. And then if we are going into a longer change needed, if it's something which is meant to be done in the long run, we are going into kind of a transformation mandate where we start looking more into external CEOs, but also internal sometimes are okay. But if we are looking into a dramatic change, so if, for example, the company is bleeding money, if major changes are needed and very fast, then we are looking into turnaround. And what our research shows is that these are the most dramatic cases where basically internal CEOs are very rarely a good solution, because internal people are the ones who have helped the organization to come where it is, and they are the one which might be more resistant to the change. So we will go now a bit more into explanation of these mandates, looking also into some examples. But basically, this is a framework which allows us to think, depending on what kind of changes are needed, how big these changes are, and how much time do we have to change to either maybe save the company sometimes, or just maintain and bring it into the future. So this is a good guidance which we have developed following a lot of interviews and getting input from people who've been there, or sometimes have been part of a failure, sometimes have been part of a success. So I think we're going on into one more poll before we go into more examples. No?
Let's drop the poll for the sake of time.
All right, then go ahead. Then I hand it over to Thomas.
Okay, so let me now take a few minutes to actually walk you through each of these mandates, give you some examples, and actually see when are they commonly used and what are the common problems with each of these mandates. And if we start from the continuation mandate, as Mariana already said, this is really often something that is focused on executing an existing strategy. We find this type of mandate very frequently in succession cases where you have a family-controlled company, where you may have a founder that is stepping back or retiring, or also sometimes where you have a long-term, very strong CEO retiring. In each of these cases, what is very clear is that the control really is not sitting with the CEO as much. The control is sitting with a board chair, with a controlling family, with a founder that is still acting in the back. And the CEO is really picked first and foremost for execution skills. You don't look for a strategist in this case. You're really looking for somebody who runs and implements the strategy. That's why Mariana mentioned that sometimes CEOs don't like to hear this, but sometimes they act really as glorified COOs. The problem with this is when you pick in this case an external CEO, you very often get conflict and misfit. An external CEO most of the time really would like to change things, to drive strategy. And that's, of course, then clashing with the controlling founder or chair. And we find very often with external CEOs here issues. An example, you all are familiar with Amazon, I would assume. Jeff Bezos this year stepped back. He stepped back, but now his title is no longer CEO. Now he is executive chair. And I think that already tells a lot. Andy Jassy, who's now the CEO, runs the organization, no doubt, but there can be no doubt either that the strategic decisions continue to be made, in this case, by Jeff Bezos. So what you see really is that the CEO role in this case is not one of being the ultimate decision maker, but being really one of executing. If you compare this with our second mandate, the evolution mandate, it looks already a bit different. Here, the idea is really about situations where you over longer periods of time try to gradually evolve the strategy, where you may have some changes in the focus of the execution. So you have some degree of change. It's no longer what I would call strategic stasis, but it's really a gradual evolution. And here, the idea really is that when you have a broad strategic direction, but you know this will need to be evolved further, when you know that over time this may change. Again, you find this often as well in some family firms when you have a transition away from a family founder towards professional CEO, but only in those instances where the family actually really takes the decision to say, okay, we are now going to take an owner's role, we leave strategy in fact to a professional. Here, internal candidates are still very useful, but they need to have a different profile than in the continuation mandate. Now you need somebody who can also develop a strategic vision, at least together with a board chair. What we also see is that in this case, outsiders start to work. They start to work when they bring in very specific skills that, for instance, an insider may not have. A typical example would be an outsider that brings in acquisition skills, for instance. One case here that comes to mind is the recent succession at Nestlé here in Switzerland. Nestlé, global firm you probably are familiar with as well, hired an outside CEO, even though they didn't want to dramatically change the strategy, but they knew that for their portfolio transformation over time that they already started, they would need somebody who really is an excellent deal maker. And they brought in, for that reason, Mark Schneider, who had a strong background in deal making and is now gradually rebuilding the portfolio of Nestlé. The challenges in this mandate here are somewhat similar as in the continuation mandate, because now you have still probably a strong board chair, but at the same time, now you have as well a strong strategic CEO. And that is often a situation that's not easy to manage. That's often a situation that leads to clashes. And may lead then to conflict. The second problem that we often see is when you have a misfit of skills. You have a CEO brought in maybe for operational skills, and then the strategy evolution comes up as a topic, and that's something that some CEOs simply are not as good at. Give you an example here of this mandate. Severin Schwan of Roche. Roche a few years back had a retiring CEO. They had been very nicely positioned in the biotech space. They had a joint venture with a US company, Genentech, and they knew that they would continue along this path, but they also knew that they would have to much more bring in diagnostics, that they would need to also change the setup. They had a joint venture with Genentech. They wanted to become an integrated biotech personal diagnostics firm. And for that, then they basically went to an internal candidate. Severin Schwan, in fact, was probably the least likely candidate people thought from the outside at the time, because he had been the head of the diagnostics business, which was a somewhat smaller business in Roche. But they picked him basically because he had already shown this command of the diagnostics business, which was becoming more important. And his first task was then to basically turn this joint venture with Genentech into a full-blown acquisition. And that's what he started, and Roche has since then been progressing superbly well. So these are two instances where, as we see, internal candidates are like the first choice. You may have an outsider in the evolution mandate. In the continuation mandate, you probably would want to stay away from outsiders. The situation changes quite a bit when we go to the next two mandates. Especially when we are looking at the transformation mandate, that's really about a radical departure from strategy. We find this when industries change, when you have discontinuities in industries, when companies are trying to reposition, or when you have the need for upgrading. When you have the need of, let's say, a family-owned company that now tries to become a global player. Often you need to fundamentally change the processes, the way you're operating. And in that case, as internal candidates that have been working in the old strategy, in the old business and industry structure, are not very well suited. This is the time when you typically go outside to candidates that have change experience, to candidates that come often with a background in the new industrial logic. And in some instances, you can have insiders, but they are then typically insiders that look very different from the rest of the organization. They are kind of the misfits of the previous situation. And in this case, you need to be mindful, we're talking about transformation here. And transformation, strategic transformations often do fail. So one of the issues clearly here is when we are talking about transformation mandates, the board needs to be mindful that this is likely to have a chance to fail. There's an inherent risk, and you need to be super careful in finding the right individual. An example here is the CEO transition that recently took place by Holcim, the global leader in the cement industry. Holcim was formed at the time still called Lafarge Holcim through the merger of Lafarge and Holcim. They started out in a very politicized environment. The first CEO had come from Lafarge side and kind of strengthened this political battle between the two camps from the two companies. And basically didn't manage to integrate the two companies. So when the board realized that they really would have to restart and depart from this politicized environment, they clearly said, we need to go outside. We need somebody who does not have baggage in either Holcim or Lafarge. And they tapped an executive in another Swiss construction company, construction materials industry, company, Jan Jenisch, who now in the past 3-4 years completely rebuilt the company, decentralized, and basically cut through the logjam that came out of the politics, completely changed the management team, etc. Because he didn't have the baggage that everybody that came from inside had of being either a Holcim or either a Lafarge person. That was no concern of his. He set out, created a new strategy, changed the team, changed the structure. Transformation mandates, first and foremost, based on changes in strategy or repositioning, we don't necessarily see in this case yet financial distress. And that is the last element that comes into the play in our final mandate and the turnaround mandate. In the turnaround mandate, it really is about addressing financial distress and breaking inertia. When you have companies that have literally run against the wall and are in financial distress, that's the time when you have the most radical changes needed. And again, this is the domain of external candidates. This is a domain of external candidates that have specifically turnaround experience. If you think of this, this is to some extent the most narrow mandate again, because here it's really about going in and making sure that the company is not going to go bankrupt in the next 2 to 3 years and turning that company around. And that's a very specific profile that only some managers have. This is not something that everybody can do, and often the managers that are able to do that actually do this over and over in different types of companies, different types of businesses. The challenge here is really that this is done under extreme time pressure. So this is not a time for strategic considerations, but it is really a time for action, for using templates that you've done in the past to save the company. Internal CEOs, if you go to internal CEOs, they often find problems here because they always are to a degree or another encumbered by the past, either objectively because they have created the past or at least in the eyes of the public. John Flannery, that Mariana mentioned earlier, found himself in this kind of a situation. GE had a huge financial problem when he became CEO. And while he did a lot of the right things, the public basically saw he was part of the past and didn't find it credible what he did. So this is often the problem with internal CEOs. That's why we go to external CEOs. But also here we need to be mindful that these turnaround specialists may not be the right people in the long run then to take the next step, to take a more transformative or evolutionary step, because they are focused on the quick turnaround. They often run out of ideas afterwards. An example of this type of a CEO is Jonathan Lewis. He came from the US company Halliburton, and this was again a merger situation when he went into Amec Foster Wheeler. Amec Foster Wheeler was formed by a UK company and a Swiss company in the oil engineering services. They were badly hit by the declining oil prices and were really with the back against the wall. Lewis came in and very quickly worked on stopping the bleeding, on getting the operating model to work again, and then eventually also get the company recapitalized. within 1.5 years, he managed to do that, and basically, instead of recapitalizing, Amek Foster Wheeler eventually was bought at a very good premium by a competitor. Jonathan Lewis, in the meanwhile, went on to lead Capita and tries to do there at the moment the same thing. That turnaround has been a little bit more challenging, given that Capita was very badly hit by the COVID crisis, but it is still work in progress. So as you see, we have 4 different turnarounds, so 4 different mandates that have very different characteristics, and as a result, you also need very different CEO profiles. So the key insight to restate of what we have found is that you really need to start to, as a board, to think about what will our company need 5 years down the line. Where do we want to be? How far are we away where we want to be? What are the kind of steps that we have to go through to get there? And then you need to start to think of what kind of a CEO profile do we need to actually accomplish that. And then you can go to look at candidates. And unfortunately, still many boards don't go these first 2 steps explicitly through enough, spend too little time on the strategy. Okay, we have gone slightly over time, but now we have time for hopefully lots of questions.
And actually we do, Thomas, so if you open up the Q&A, we could already start. Maybe I take the first one and you take the second one. So we have a first question here, the difference between turnaround and transformation mandates. You're right, they are in a way similar in terms of a strategic change needed, but the big difference is the time horizon. So on one hand, we basically have the transformation mandate, which allow a little more time. So the strategic change is needed, it's important and it's needed, but we have time to make that change. While on the turnaround mandate, the company may be already bleeding money. So it's much more dramatic. So changes need to be made at a much quicker pace. So if you look back into our metrics, there is on one side the time horizon, on the other side, the extent of strategic change. And in both turnaround and transformation mandate, the extent of strategic change needed is high, it's important, but in one we have more time and the other one we don't have time. And this is why also Thomas mentioned, in case of turnaround situation, typically we look at outside CEOs which have experience to pick up companies which are in important financial distress and they need to make important changes. So having done it earlier, allow them to mentally think of the steps which are important and can help them saving the company, basically. So this would be the kind of the main difference. Thomas, go ahead if you want to add something before you go to the next question.
Yeah, maybe if I add one thing is, while the difference may seem to some extent a thin line, you often find very different CEOs being hired. The turnaround situation is really a very, very specific domain where you really have what I would almost call turnaround artists in the CEO positions that really do only turnaround and not necessarily go much beyond that, while transformation can take very different forms. So as in any framework, of course, there are some managers that are able to do both, but often they are not. The second one I thought was really, really interesting. The question about that business models need to change, and a lot of companies need to focus on transformation right now. In fact, what we do observe, I think, is that there is a lot of boards at the moment looking at their situation, if they are in fact able to take the next step, take the necessary changes in their organization, in their business model with the current CEO. And we do see, in fact, more CEO changes at the moment than in most periods of the time. So we really have an increased number of CEO changes going on at the moment because, as you very correctly, very correctly point out, we see a need for transformation in a lot of organizations. And the people that brought you here aren't always the people that can get you there. That's a reality. So we do see these changes.
We go to the next one. We have a question on whether there might be a blur between turnaround and evolution. I'll start, and then Thomas, you can add and complement. I would tend to agree with you that it may be sometimes difficult over time to identify which one it really is, because the starting point there, as you probably are thinking, is that the time goes on and then things change, and then there is a strategy iteration, and there may be changes and adjustment. However, the starting point when hiring a new CEO, when the board is looking at the new CEO, is that the starting point is that the thinking at that time is that in a case of a kind of a turnaround, we are looking at high strategic change needed. So there is already an understanding that the current strategy needs to be adjusted. While for the evolution mandate, the starting point is that the extent of the strategic change needed is actually small. Now, what can actually happen over time is anyway different, and the reality can always happen that all the four mandates blurred and things change as you start, as you go, as you find new things. Like in the case of John Agee, he started with an understanding, but then he very quickly realized that what's needed was something else, and even the board realized that. So I think that one has to pay attention to, when hiring the CEO, we need to think of what is needed and looking into this kind of two axes, but then one is to be mentally flexible, and then changes will always be needed as one go along, and then the mandates can blur one into the other, and not only the turnaround and evolution, but probably all the four of them can blur one into the other depending on what actually one finds. Thomas, do you want to have something? I think we need to also be a bit.
No. I think I'll take the next two that are kind of connected, and that's the question about or comment about fixer and maintainer, and kind of, can you collapse this actually into two differences? I think it's a little bit disagree with that. I would not bring it down just to saying, okay, you have on the one hand the fixer that does radical departure, and then you have on the other hand the maintainer. I think the maintainer best really maps on this continuation mandate, but let's face it, if you have that for a long period of time and you're engaging in no change, you're not evolving the strategy in any respect, you're not engaging in some gradual adjustment of the strategy, you really run into the issue that you're kind of creating these transformation needs. So in a way, I would argue that the evolution mandate is kind of the sweet spot where you ideally want to be, in the sense of that you have a CEO that is good on execution, that is gradually evolving the strategy so that you don't need the radical changes. And that should be more than just maintenance. I think in an evolution mandate, you want to have a CEO that actively further evolves the business model, etc. But then there are situations that are often externally driven, or sometimes as well because the company internally hasn't been operating as well as it could, that you do require these new ideas. But nonetheless, I think it's important to make this distinction, because otherwise you're maybe creating this need for transformation yourself by not taking enough constant strategy evolution action if you are looking over longer periods of time. Continuation and maintenance is something you can do for 2-3 years maybe if you already have a strong strategy, but not for 5 or 7 years as a time horizon. So time horizon requires this need for a gradual change in all instances, at least in our view.
We are going into the role of the turnaround CEO. This is something that actually Thomas mentioned earlier, that these are professionals. These are almost turnaround professionals more than CEO professionals. So these are people which come on board, and they may basically pick up a situation, and then it's 3 to 5 years, and then they tend to move on. We actually looked recently at some research which shows that in any situation, a CEO should not be more than 10 years in a role. We do see some which have been longer, but they are not really able anymore to innovate and to kind of renew themselves. So in a normal situation, a CEO should anyway stay no longer than 10 years. In a turnaround situation, the professional comes in, stays the company, maybe stays on board 3-5 years, and then typically tends to move to the next role. This is roughly what we observe. And then, of course, there are always exceptions, and one is to look at specific situations. They may be also turnaround executives, which at some point in their career, they don't want to do that anymore. They may want to kind of stay then maybe in a role for a longer time, or simply move and stay into the board. But this is roughly the timeline. Thomas, you want to take the next one for the sake?
Yeah, I think we are very much on the turnaround CEO, because this is a tricky thing. It's often counterintuitive to say we take now a CEO on for 2 to 3 years to really do the hard lifting of a turnaround, and then we may move to somebody else to take it to the next step. But we can think of this, people have typically less problems with this idea if you're saying we're taking an interim CEO for 2-3 years to execute the existing strategy, and in the meanwhile we are looking more long-term about what will be then the next leader for the next 5 to 10 years. I think the same idea can be applied in the turnaround case, but that requires that the board is very active. That requires that the board actually looks and sees that, the turnaround CEO really sticks to fixing the most pressing problems and is not because often they then start to almost generate problems. We had a really interesting conversation with this type of a CEO who said, after 2 or 3 years when I've done with this, I'm like itching, what am I going to fix next? And I'm almost inclined to generate my next problem myself so that I have something to fix. So you need to be mindful of this as a board and stay very close with this. And if you
let's go on. We need to go on, otherwise we don't manage to answer the question. There's a question from Derek. Is the next one?
Yeah.
You want to go on and take?
I think that was already, that was relating to Derek's question. And, if we take Rata's question about the disadvantage of keeping this person on, is that a turnaround CEO can do harm in the next stage, because that's no longer their strengths. They may run out of ideas and not be able to, in the long run, develop the company, if that's really their core focus. Okay, Mariana, headhunting, that is I think your domain.
Well, I think this is a bit of a blurred area. We receive actually this question quite often, and we are very careful at not necessarily answering it, because it goes a bit beyond actually our research area, in the sense that when we are looking at the actual skill and experience and cultural field, we are going into slightly different area. But we always say, as a general statement, that a good organization needs to have a bench of internal candidates available to take over under any situation. So a good organization should have candidates available for all the 4 mandates, because it can happen also that a CEO suddenly dies, and then you need to kind of take over immediately. However, we do know that when there are bigger problems, very often the boards tend to look at the headhunters and looking at them outside. We do not always think that headhunters are a good solution, because headhunters tend to look at a specific set of candidates and maybe someone in the network. They're not necessarily looking at it very widely, but sometimes they are unnecessary evil. And what we observe based on the interviews we conducted, that the internal grooming versus the external headhunting does not always happen for rational reasons, but happens more depending on the situations that a company has at hand. So if they have an internal candidate, they are looking at internal one. If they don't, they just go to headhunting independently of what rationally one should be doing. Let's say that looking at the external candidates through headhunting has the advantage that one can more rationally think of what is needed, and it's not necessarily influenced by the people you have around you. But we do not think that it is always easy to rationalize when you should go with kind of when the board should look internally and what should look externally, unless you have a firm mandate. Thomas, I don't know if you want to add. As I said, I think this is a tricky question that we try not to answer too specifically, because
in all honesty, since we're running out of time, I think, please, we're happy to engage in any conversations on these topics also after the seminar. We still have a number of questions here. Yes. Wusani, what are we going to do?
No. Basically, let's just answer perhaps one more question. Lena's had her hand up for a while. I'm going to allow her just to ask a question online.
The measurement is a super interesting question because you need to really look at when we talk about CEO succession, you need to think about two things. On the one hand, you need to try to very early measure if the person actually gets traction in the organization, and that is something you can see often in relatively early on. But at the same time, if you think about the transformation, you do need to take longer time frames, like 2 to 3 years at least, to see if a transformation works. But I think what is important is that you are, as a board, identifying upfront what are the kind of milestones that we need to hit for that transformation to work out, so that you are not only making this based on financial, but that you're identifying upfront a roadmap for the transformation and milestones, so that you early enough can take action when you notice that it goes out of hand, and that you then think about, okay, do we have the right management team? And there was a very good comment as well in the chat. I noticed on that, in fact, this is not only an issue of changing a CEO, it sometimes also requires that you bring in know-how onto the board, that you bring in people with specific know-how onto the board to support that. Good. Maybe we are running out of time, let us do still a final. Okay. Let me see if I can actually get this, our shameless plug that now doesn't show.
Meanwhile, picks another question, and I answered not knowing where you were arriving, so I was able to answer a question from Radha. I typed it in.
If you found what we described here interesting, there is more information available. We have written a book about this topic. You can find some additional readings as well as some more information about the book on our webpage, thenextceo.ch. And there's also a discount available on the book from Routledge's page if you use the code that is on this slide. The slides will be shared, I believe, so I'll leave the shameless plug at this point. And we go to the last slide.
So thank you so much for joining us, Mariana and Thomas. Very insightful and thought-provoking webinar today. One of the best for 2021, definitely. What we'll be doing is we will send the rest of the questions that were not answered. We'll send you an email, and then perhaps you can just type out the answers to those, and we'll send them to the attendees, if that works well for you guys. Yes, definitely. I see Mariana is still typing an answer there.
I'm trying to answer whatever is missing very quickly, but please do reach out. We can answer more properly and also engage in conversations.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for coming through today, guys. We really, really appreciate it. And for our viewers, have a further amazing week ahead.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.